Hello, ladies and gents. This is Windsor speaking. Welcome to the next and final edition of Mr. Windsor Teaches World War II. So we've gone through the World War II scheme now. We talked about the notable events, people, and places in World War II, and we're going to finally figure out this lesson, how it came to an end, and why as well. So before we begin, thank you for tuning in, by the way. And before we begin, let us recap what we already know. Let's have 3 columns or bullet point lists. It's in one column, have notable people in World War II. In the second column, notable places. And in the third, notable events, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to give you a few moments. You might want to consult with some of your past notes while you're doing that task or before you do that task. And I'll give you about 5 or so minutes in order to achieve that task. Please pause the video now and we will review when you're done. Okay, so let's think about some key information about World War II so far in this scheme of work. So key people, so the RAF, I suppose you could say the RAF is an organisation, but of course made up of people. It's the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, responsible for the victory of the Battle of Britain. Had they not won the Battle of Britain, the Germans would have had a clear path to launch a land invasion of Britain. The Luftwaffe was basically the German counterpart of the Royal Air Force. It's the German Air Force. Obviously, they fought against the British Air Force in the skies at the Battle of Britain. Of course, we have Hitler, leader of Nazi Germany, became Chancellor in 1933, and of course Führer a bit later, and led Germany throughout World War II, right up towards the end of World War II as well. Churchill, of course, a lot of controversy surrounding Churchill lately in the news regarding his statue. But Churchill, of course, was the leader of Britain, Prime Minister of Britain during World War II, and was responsible for many great victories during the war itself. But let's think about him in the context of World War II and in Europe rather than anything else right now. Paratroopers are some of the people who jumped out of planes to parachute down into occupied France behind enemy lines to clear the path for the landing at D-Day. The Nazi Party, or a political party at first that rose to prominence in Germany, and of course came into power and launched World War II and what they called the Third Reich, the expansion of the German Empire. So let's move on to places. So Normandy is where the D-Day landings were staged after a long sort of campaign of making sure the wrong information got into German hands. Rather than landing slightly further north, they decided to land at Normandy, where the Germans were not expecting them. Stalingrad is the city in Russia that Hitler at the last minute chose to attack rather than Moscow, its capital city. Kreuzberg and Wedding were the districts of Berlin that were bombed. This drove Hitler to change his plans at the Battle of Britain at the last minute, and the aerial battle, the Battle of Britain, at the last minute and bomb cities instead. Had he not changed his mind, the Battle of Britain might have been victorious for the Germans. Berlin is the capital city of Germany, and London, of course, is the capital city of Britain. Events: Battle of Britain, which we've described a little bit in detail anyway. It's an aerial battle between the RAF and the Luftwaffe. Britain ends up winning this battle due to things like greater engineering of the British planes, the Spitfire, and also the invention and use of radar, which allowed them to see where the German planes were. The Battle of Stalingrad, where the Russians bravely fought off the Nazi army. The Nazis, of course, were not given any winter clothing, and so eventually they froze, which had a very, very poor effect on morale and led to the eventual defeat of the German army at Stalingrad. D-Day was when the Allied forces, so that's the British, Americans, French, Australian, New Zealand forces, all landed on Normandy in order to reclaim occupied France from the Nazi army. And the Wolf's Lair was one of Hitler's bases. It was an underground bunker where he hid for a decent proportion of the war, and he kept his personal doctor, Theodor Morell, there with him as well, who kept him dosed up on all kinds of different things to help him get through. One of those things allegedly was meant to be something similar to heroin called Eukodal, which was his drug of choice, if Norman Ohler and his book Blitzed is to be believed. So those are some of the key things, and if some of those things are lost on you, you can of course pause this video, rewind and write down some of the key information to do with each of these things as well. So let's move on. Okay, so what are we going to be talking about? So the atomic bomb is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at some contextual information, so some information about the world at the time in order to help us do that. And we're going to see, we're going to do that in order so that we can see how the atomic bomb ended World War II. So let's review a couple of lessons ago. We talked about D-Day. Lesson before this one, we spoke about Jewish persecution in Germany. So let's review a little bit about the landing at D-Day, because otherwise this lesson doesn't make a great deal of sense without it. So remember that the Allied forces are landing on the north coast of France at a place called Normandy. So there were 5 beaches where the attack was centered. They were Gold, Sword, looked after by the British mostly, Juno. There was also Nebraska and Omaha. Nebraska and Omaha beaches were mainly American soldiers. Juno was generally Canadian, French, New Zealand, and Australian soldiers, and Golden Sword were British. So what happened then? They landed on these 5 beaches. They played a trick on the German army. They made sure they got the wrong information, so the Germans thought they were landing slightly further north. They did very clever things like creating inflatable tanks, which the German planes then saw from the air and thought that they were going to attack at a certain place. So then paratroopers landed behind enemy lines, blowing up key targets in order to clear the path for these soldiers landing at the beaches. Also, there was quite a lot of bombing going on behind enemy lines, again to clear the path. That's when these ships would have brought these soldiers along to the north coast of France, now that the path is slightly clearer, in order to begin storming the beaches. You can see this actually at the beginning section of the film Saving Private Ryan. Also, a few days ago, on the 6th of June, was the 76th anniversary of the D-Day landings, and there were many soldiers there who were about perhaps 17, 18 years old, before their lives had even really begun, who volunteered to help storm the beaches to take France back from occupied Germany. So many young men lost their lives in that battle, so it's worthwhile us being aware of that. Okay, so Omaha and Nebraska beaches. Left is Nebraska, right is Omaha, were the beaches that had the highest casualties. So there was many thousands of deaths at these beaches as well. Okay, but eventually led to about 150,000 Allied soldiers being on the north coast of France, ready to sweep back through and reclaim France from the Nazi German army. Oh yes. Also, these soldiers, these Allied soldiers, they were British, they were American, they were Canadian, they were French, they were also Australian and New Zealand as well. Okay. So let's sort of backtrack a little bit, get a little bit more information about D-Day. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen here is where the Allied soldiers landed. The black dots are the Nazi German army, and eventually these blue, yellow, and red dots will sweep through the north coast of France and rotate anti-clockwise and start heading towards Berlin. The Allies, Britain, USA, Canada, France, Australia, and New Zealand, landed on the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944 and began pushing their way through the overstretched Nazi army. It was not long before they had gained a significant amount of ground back from the Nazis. From the east, the Red Army, the Russian army, was advancing on Berlin. This is what the scholar Norman Ohler and his book Blitz, Drugs in Nazi Germany has to say about Berlin at the time of the Red Army's invasion. On the 27th of April, Hitler gave his followers potassium cyanide capsules. These were basically poison for them to take if they felt as if there was no other way out. And if the Allies got too close, rather than being captured, they had the choice to take the poison instead. Goebbels' wife, so Goebbels was a close colleague of Hitler. Goebbels' wife Magda gave 6 of these poison capsules to their children rather than have them being caught by the Allies. Hitler tested the poison on his beloved dog, an Alsatian named Blondie. One of the things about Hitler, he's very, very keen on Alsatians and he loved his dogs. He wrote one last political statement, which he could barely sign since his hand was shaking so much. His doctor's stash of drugs, such as strong morphine and Eucadal, had dried up, leaving him a wreck of a man. In his statement, he raged against the Jews, blaming them for everything and calling them the poisoners of the world. Meanwhile, methamphetamine was being handed out to kid soldiers in front of the Olympic Stadium in Berlin to keep them from going haywire at the sight of the Red Army's tanks advancing. Berlin had become a firestorm, explosions everywhere, throwing soil into the air. So what is quite striking about this story as well is that now even young German boys are being called up to fight against an invading Russian army. Realistically, they do not stand much of a chance, but what they decide to do is to drug them up with this methamphetamine that the Nazi army has been known to use in order to give them a little bit of pep to maybe last a few minutes while fighting. Many young German lives lost as well. Hitler, without the last golden shot of his drug of choice, Eukodal, opted for the bullet. He worried that his hands would shake too much to deliver himself a killing blow. There's only a set number of bullets, and if he misses due to his shaky hands, he doesn't have another bullet. He hastily married his partner, Eva Braun, who had traveled to the besieged city. After the ghostly wedding ceremony, spaghetti was served, with tomato sauce on the side, hydrogen cyanide, the poison, for dessert, and a bullet in the brain from a 6.35mm Walther on April the 30th. So there's this quite strange scene going in the Chancellery, the Nazi headquarters in Berlin, where everyone knows the Red Army is closing in around them, and they have the choice to either take their own lives with the small amount of bullets they have, or quite nastily with this cyanide capsule. But before he dies, Hitler wants to get married to his partner, Eva Braun. Their wedding ceremony is said to be a very, very morbid affair, and their wedding meal, even more morbid, spaghetti with tomato sauce on the side. So his final moments, suitably perhaps, very, very quite morbid and horrible. So what happened next after the death of Germany? One would suspect that after the death of Hitler, that World War II would end pretty quickly after that. Unfortunately, it wasn't greatly the case. After D-Day and Stalingrad, the Allied armies were advancing on Germany from both sides. By April 1945, Russian troops were fighting through Berlin. Hitler was surrounded and knew he had lost. He committed suicide on April 30th. It is believed that Hitler and his wife both took cyanide, then Hitler shot himself. Their bodies were cremated by the remaining people in the bunker, to stop them from being mutilated by the Russians. The war in Europe ended on 8th of May 1945 with the surrender of the German army. There is a bit of a misconception that World War II was fought only in Europe. It's also, the reason why it's called a world war is because it involves more than the people of a handful of nations. It was also fought in northern Africa, and it was also fought in the Pacific, so the areas around Japan, Philippines, that sort of area in China. However, the Americans were still fighting a violent and bloody campaign in the Pacific against Japan. America had entered the war after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. It was an attack that no one was expecting. Many American soldiers died, and Pearl Harbor was the base of many American military ships. Again, this is covered in many films that you can still watch to this day. The atomic bomb. Two nuclear atomic bombs were dropped on Japan to force the country to surrender. The first, called Little Boy, was dropped on August the 6th, targeting Hiroshima, a city in Japan with a large amount of industry. So this perhaps produced quite a lot of metal that Japan could use for making weapons and that sort of thing. Around 80,000 people were killed from the blast, with another 60,000 dying later from radiation poisoning. 3 days later, on the 9th of August, a second bomb called Fat Man was dropped in Nagasaki, killing about 40,000 more people. On August the 15th, Japan announced their surrender. Okay, so a little bit of information there about the war going on in the Pacific. The war wasn't just fought around Europe. It's a big misconception that a lot of people have today. So being fought in Northern Africa and the Pacific as well. So before we continue, if you have your booklets, these questions are in there with today's lesson. If not, I'd like to see if you can answer these questions using the information from previous few slides. Keeping in mind that you can rewind this video and get the information again. All you'd have to do is click pause and then look backwards in this video. I'm going to give you a few minutes in which to do that. Okay, so let's figure out some of this key information about the atomic bomb, Japan, and the Pacific, and the war going on in the Pacific. So on the April 30th, 1945, he took his own life and Eva Braun's life as well. They both took poison, and then Hitler ended up shooting himself. When did the war in Europe end? Actually ended on the 7th of May, about a week later. Control of Germany was handed over to the next most senior military official, which was a guy called Admiral Dönitz, who was in charge of the German Navy and the German ships. So he was given power, and not long after, he himself signs the paperwork to surrender Germany to the Allied forces. So America was still fighting Japan. America joined the war in 1941 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The first atomic bomb was called Little Boy, and it was dropped on Hiroshima. I was a little bit confused as to why these bombs have names. Perhaps it was something to do with their appearance. But also, another key thing is that they used a slightly different element in them, the radioactive elements, and to create different kind of scales of explosion. So the Little Boy bomb was based using uranium, which is a highly radioactive metal. And the second bomb, Fat Man, had plutonium in it, and that one was dropped on Nagasaki. How many people were killed from the two atomic bombs? So the total body count as a Little Boy killed out 80,000 with the initial blast and 60,000 through radiation sickness, and the Fat Man killed another 40,000 on top of that. So a bit of quick maths: 140, 180,000-ish deaths from these two bombs. When did Japan announce their surrender? August the 15th, 1945. So after the final participants of the war, Japan were knocked out and they surrendered. This brings an end to World War II, the fighting of World War II. So let's find out a little bit more about these two bombings. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There are still a lot of arguments to this day about whether dropping the nuclear bombs on Japan were justified. Some people argued that it brought about an end to the war. After all, Japan did surrender shortly afterwards, but at what cost? One of the key arguments to support the bombing is the idea that it actually saved lives. Overall, it is estimated that 150,000 people died from the two bombs, with more dying from radiation poisoning in the months afterwards. However, President Truman saw the alternative as even worse. He thought that the only way to defeat Japan would have been direct assault on the mainland, so land fighting. It was estimated that this would cost about 2 million American deaths, with up to 10 million Japanese deaths. I have a bit of a problem with these statistics, actually, because first of all, this information is coming from the American government, so yeah, I mean, especially today, we have a certain viewpoint of America, and it could be, I suppose, 1940s kind of fake news. Of course, the American government are going to turn out certain statistics in order to justify their opinion, no matter how bad their actions have been. Also, 2 million American deaths with 10 million Japanese deaths. Where are they pulling these figures out? Why would only 2 million Americans die versus 10 million Japanese if they fought on the land? These statistics, in my mind anyway, are kind of just plucked out of the air in an effort to justify some pretty awful actions. If this was the case, then surely the sacrifice for the bomb was worth it. I'll leave that up to you guys to decide. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, many people highlight the negatives of the bomb. Some say that Japan was already losing in the Pacific, and without its ally Germany, it may have surrendered soon anyway. Nevertheless, at the time, Japan was insistent that it would not give up, so this argument is not very convincing. I'll leave you to decide if that's convincing or not. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Perhaps worst is the effect of the bombs in the long run. People killed by the bomb were ordinary civilians. Very few of them were involved in the military. Some say that this makes the bombing a war crime due to the high levels of civilian casualties. Similarly, the effects of the bomb were horrific. Many that didn't die were left blind from the light and severely burnt. Radiation also stayed in the area for a long time afterwards, with radioactive rain falling and causing cancer and mutation. Agriculture, farming, and water was also affected in the area, again leading to further civilian casualties. Perhaps the biggest question is whether it was necessary to drop the second bomb. Hadn't they made their point already? Surely one bomb killing 80,000 plus another 60,000 on top would already make a strong statement. What would be the point in that second bomb? Some people think the second bomb was really just because the USA wanted to test their new weapon. The A-bomb was a new invention, and perhaps to show power to Russia, who had become the new enemy in the Cold War. So maybe this is just America flexing its muscles, saying, yeah, well, you better not mess with me because I've got A-bombs. I've got this new weapon that can obliterate cities. Okay, so if you have your booklet, you have this page that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, and if not, you can use a blank sheet of paper and create two columns. Was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki justified? So was there a good enough reason for it? Give reasons for the dropping of the bombs onto civilian cities on the left, so reasons that it was a good idea, and on the right, reasons that it was a bad idea. reasons that against dropping the bomb on those two civilian cities. I'm going to give you a decent chunk of time to do that, say about 5 or 10 minutes. Please give yourself enough time to do that. Okay, so let's think about potential reasons for and against. I have my own relatively strong opinion on this, but of course you are entitled to have your own. Don't let my perception colour yours. So 4, well, people say, well, it's probably justified because it ended the war, didn't it? Yeah, not good enough reason in my mind anyway. It ended the war. Japan was the last participant in Japan surrendering to the Allies. That caused the end of the Second World War. More lives might have been lost. 150,000 people died from the bombings, but the American president predicted 10 to 12 million lives might be lost if it continued. It was doubtful that Japan would have given up by itself. So 3 good reasons, well-ish, 3 reasons-ish for 4. So against, Japan might have given up by itself after the defeat of Germany. The vast majority of those who died were civilians, so it caused radioactive rain, caused people to go blind. People died of a very horrific and long drawn-out death caused by radiation sickness. There are also reports for many years afterwards that children who were born in this area would often have horrific mutations on account of the radiation still around the bombing sites. Not only that, but farming was affected, which would lead to there not being enough food, or that the food would have radiation in it already, leading to more radiation sickness of the people who ate it. So not just 150,000 people died in the short term, but many hundreds, perhaps even thousands died in the long term as well. So the actual body count is probably way higher than 150,000. Those who survived often ended up blind from the light of the explosion. Radiation sickness from the bomb's aftermath would have caused a slow and agonizing death for many more people. Was the first bomb not enough to make the statement America wanted? Was this just an opportunity for America to test the newly developed A-bomb? Was this also not just an opportunity for America to flex its muscles on the world stage, making himself look like the big man, so that no one else would try and mess with him in future years? Okay, so this is where we come to a little bit more independent work on your part. If you have your booklet, it looks a bit like this on the right-hand side. So let's start thinking about the views of the American people and soldiers. Now, first of all, let's not labor under the misconception that just because the American government ordered for this to happen, that everyone in America would be for it. It's the same how we have people speaking against Donald Trump, even though we just assume that often we'll just assume that America goes along with whatever he says. It would be foolish to assume that everyone would agree to this action just because the American government ordered it. So step 1, write a diary entry from the perspective of an American soldier, detailing the moral problem of dropping the bomb. What are the fors and what are the against of dropping not only 1 bomb, but 2 bombs onto these Japanese people? Yes, Japan is the enemy, but again, it's made up of people who have nothing to do with the war, nothing to do with the fighting, and nothing to do with the number of people who've died in the war. So to that extent, can you really approve of what the American government have done? Underneath, the extension, how influential, so that means important or significant, do you think this event has been in world history? Give reasons and evidence for your answer. So a lot of this still affects the way the nations view each other even today. I believe parts of Japan still hold a bit of a grudge because they remember, well, not necessarily a grudge, but they rightly remember the actions that the American government took against them, and perhaps they're quite aware of that fact. So have a crack at those tasks. It's going to be a bit of a longer task. It's going to take about 10 to 15 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, please. Okay, so let's begin wrapping up with some key takeaways from today's lesson on the end of World War II and the atomic bomb. So first of all, we had Hitler, obviously leader of Nazi Germany, the Führer is what they called him. He and his new wife, Eva Braun, take their own lives in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. They both take a cyanide capsule. He also shoots himself. So, however, Japan is still very much a participant in the Second World War, fighting predominantly America because it is the closest allied nation to them. So the reason why they are participating in the war is because they're allied with Germany, and the reason why America entered the war in the first place is because they ended up bombing Pearl Harbor, a surprise attack that no one was expecting. From that point onwards, America joined the war pretty much out of revenge for what happened. So there were 2 bombs signified by these 2 icons here, the Big Boy and the Fat Man. Big Boy was made using the chemical uranium, and the Fat Man was used was using the chemical plutonium, both with devastating effects. So there are atomic bombs, and they caused explosions. You can actually see YouTube videos of nuclear bomb tests happening. They tend to test them in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at a place called Bikini Atoll, and they are filmed, and they produce these enormous mushroom clouds at absolutely incredible amounts of destructive power. Many hundreds of thousands died. 150 are estimated, but if you think about the long-term effects of the radiation sickness, the farming that was affected, not enough food produced, famine, starvation, blindness, illness, sickness, mutations, all of these awful side effects caused by the actions of America at the atomic bomb. Finally, as I just said, this led to many, many people getting very ill and dying. 150,000 died initially. Then radiation sickness causes a slow and agonizing and painful death. Many people went blind. Many babies born in the area suffered from mutations for many years to come. Radioactive rain also killed agriculture and farming, leading to people becoming very, very hungry, and some of them starving to death. So I have my own opinion. I'm not necessarily sure that the dropping of these two bombs can be justified, but ultimately it's very difficult for me to say that, as I'm not President Truman, the President of the United States. It's a very difficult decision to make. It's one of those in history that is still debated to this day, and I cannot profess to be an expert in international relations, or nor would I want to be put in the position of making that order. So let me leave you with one final thought before I finish off my lesson. So this is in one of the two cities, Hiroshima or Nagasaki. This is outside the town hall. This is still here today. What we see burnt on the white town hall steps is the shadow of someone caught in the atomic blast. The atomic blast is so intense and so destructive that this person's body would have been vaporized almost instantly. He would have seen this huge destructive cloud rising in the distance and a massive shockwave from the atomic blast, which would have killed him instantly, burning him to ashes, in essence, leaving this shadowy, ghostly figure on the steps of the city hall. The moral question is this: if we have weapons that cause this amount of destruction, both in the short term or the long term, can we ever justify using that weapon on civilians, on people, non-combatants who are not fighting? I'll leave that moral question to you to consider, but this is one in a very, very, very long list of atrocious things that have happened in wartime. And I think all too often we separate ourselves from the reality and the humanity of these events. These were real people who suffered at the hands of not just other nations in the war, but if you're a Japanese person in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, at the hands of the American government, who didn't really care if you were a soldier or a civilian. So very awful and atrocious things happened in wartime. That is the end of my World War II lesson and my World War II scheme of work, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you if you've been consistently tuning in. And even if you haven't, I hope you've enjoyed the parts that you have been tuning in and listening in for. It's been an absolute pleasure to record these lessons for you. Thank you and goodbye.